The night smelled of dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey when the auction lanterns flared to life behind the saloon, throwing long, crooked shadows across the corral like bars of a prison, and she stood there, barefoot, wrists trembling, chin lifted not in pride but in refusal, an 18-year-old. Young woman with eyes too old for her face while her father swayed beside her, breath sour, hat tipped low, already counting money he hadn't earned. Because a bottle mattered more than blood, more than the girl who'd learned to keep quiet when the world learned to take. The men circled, murmuring prices the way buzzards test the wind, and the auctioneer cleared his throat, calling out numbers like nails hammered into a coffin, and each bid felt like another inch of ground giving way beneath her, until memory flooded in. How her mother once sang to drown out storms, how the ranch burned in a dry summer and never came back, how promises rot when soaked in liquor, while her father nodded at every raise. Eyes glassy, hand already reaching for the saloon door as if the bottle waited with arms open. She stared past the men to the far fence where the prairie lay dark and wide, thinking freedom had to be out there somewhere, even if it took running barefoot until her feet bled. When a voice cut through the din, low, steady, not loud but certain. "I'll pay double." And the corral went still as a held breath. The cowboy stood apart from the others, coat dusty, boots scarred, the kind of man who carried quiet like a weapon, his gaze fixed not on her body but on her face as if asking a question no one else had bothered to ask. And when the auctioneer laughed, thinking it a joke, the cowboy repeated it louder this time, coins chiming as he laid them out one by one on the rail, silver catching the lantern light. More money than the room expected, more than the father had ever held sober, and the father's grin split wide as he lurched forward, hand outstretched, because whiskey already burned in his throat and his mind. She felt panic rise. Double could still mean owned, could still mean another cage, but the cowboy lifted a palm, stopping the auctioneer, stopping the father too, and said not for work, not for keeps, to save her life, and something in the way he said it like a vow. Made to the ground itself, made. The murmurs falter, the auctioneer hesitated, counting coins, counting trouble, then shrugged because money speaks loudest in places like this, and the gavel came down with a crack that felt like thunder, and her father grabbed the cash and staggered off toward the saloon without a backward glance, the bottle already uncorked in his imagination, leaving her standing there with a future suddenly unhooked from the track. It had been racing down. The cowboy stepped closer, close enough she could see the dust in the creases of his eyes, the scar along his jaw that looked old and healed, and he said her name softly. He'd asked it earlier, remembered it now and promised nothing except this: "You're safe." And safety sounded strange, like a word from another language. But she followed because the night had teeth and his shadow moved like shelter. He cut the rope that had been tied for show, handed her his coat without touching her, and walked her past the saloon where laughter spilled like poison, past the fence out toward the dark where his horse waited. And as they rode, the prairie opened wide, stars scattered like spilled grain, and for the first time since she could remember, the road didn't feel like a trap but a question, and she wondered what kind of man pays double for a life he doesn't own, what kind of future waits beyond a night like this, and whether salvation always comes quiet instead of shouting. Far behind them, the saloon door slammed and the bottle was raised, but ahead the wind carried a different promise, one made of miles and choices and the thin, fierce hope that tomorrow could be argued into being. Morning came pale and uncertain, the kind of dawn that doesn't promise kindness but offers a chance, and she woke to the sound of wind brushing canvas and the low, patient snort of a horse, heart leaping before memory caught up and reminded her she was not tied, not watched, not owned, because the cowboy had kept his word through the long night ride and then some, pitching camp by a dry arroyo, where the earth smelled clean and the fire burned steady, and when she sat up wrapped in his coat he was already awake. Coffee black as midnight poured into a tin cup. He sat near her without comment, giving her space like it mattered. He told her his name when she asked, not boasting, not hiding, and said where he was headed, not a destination so much as a direction, north toward honest work and land that didn't swallow men. Whole, and he offered a choice with no hook in it. Said she could ride with him as far as she wished or take the money he'd set aside and go where she pleased, because saving a life meant giving it back, and the weight of that choice pressed on her chest heavier than any rope ever had. Because freedom, she learned, can be terrifying when you're used to cages. They rode together anyway. the prairie rolling out like a long confession. And as the miles stacked, up she told him pieces, never, all at once, about a childhood spent reading, weather instead of books, about learning to keep quiet because quiet survived, about the night her mother left and the years after when whiskey spoke louder than love, and he listened without interrupting, eyes on the horizon, as if her words were miles too, and he intended to carry them. Trouble found them near noon in the shape of two riders cutting across the flats, one wearing the father's hat like a joke gone bad, breath already sour even at this hour, shouting claims that turned the air ugly, and for a moment the old fear clawed back. But the cowboy slid down from his horse slow and deliberate, put himself between her and the noise, and said simply, "She's not for sale," with a calm that made threats sound childish. And when the men pressed closer, he didn't reach for his gun until they didn't raise his voice until they lied. And the standoff broke the way these things often do, not with glory but with sense, because even drunk men recognize a losing hand when it's laid bare. And they rode off cursing, leaving dust and shame behind. After that, something shifted inside her, a knot loosening, because safety had held under pressure. And as the afternoon stretched, she asked him why, the question she'd been carrying since the lanterns went dark. Why pay double? Why step in? Why risk it? And he told her about a sister once, sold cheap to circumstance and silence, about being too late and learning the cost of hesitation, about deciding that if he ever had the chance again he wouldn't bargain with regret. And the truth of it settled between them like a bridge, fragile but real. By evening they reached a spread of cottonwoods along a river that remembered rain, and he said this was as far as he'd planned to go with her unless she chose otherwise. Laid out options like cards face up, work at a nearby ranch run by decent people, a town where a woman could earn and keep her wages, or the road with him a while longer, until she found her footing, and she surprised herself by choosing the road, not because she needed him, but because she trusted him, and trust felt like learning to walk again, awkward and brave. Days turned into weeks into a rhythm of sunrises and honest miles, and she learned the language of horses, the weight of a rifle, the pride of a day's labor done right, while he learned to laugh again, quiet and startled, as if the sound had been sleeping. When they parted at last, it wasn't with tears but with plans, a handshake that became an embrace only after she made the first move, and he left her at a place where her name would be spoken kindly, where work waited and so did tomorrow. And as he rode away, she felt the truth settle in full. Being saved had been the beginning, not the ending. Because a life isn't something you're given once and done. It's something you choose again every morning. And if this chapter leaves you wondering how courage grows, how redemption finds its way back, the town by the river had a way of testing promises. And she felt it the first morning she woke under a real roof with a window that faced east, sunlight spilling across the floor like a dare. Because safety once found demands to be defended every day after. And she rose before the bell, pulled on borrowed boots that fit well enough, and stepped into work that did not look at her sideways. The ranch ran honest, its owner a woman with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, who asked no questions that weren't offered and paid wages on time. And in that steady rhythm, mending fences, learning accounts, riding out to check water, she found a strength that had been there all along, coiled and waiting. Nights were quiet, but quiet is not empty, and sometimes the past crept in with the smell of whiskey carried by strangers passing through town, or with the memory of a hand reaching for money where a hand should have reached for a daughter. And on those nights she wrote letters she never sent, folded them small and burned them in the stove, watching words turn to heat instead of hurt. News traveled the way it always does, faster than truth and slower than fear. And one afternoon a writer brought word that her father had been found in a ditch with the bottle still clutched, alive but ruined, and the town buzzed with the kind of sympathy that asks nothing of itself. But she felt only a steady, strange calm, because grief had already done its work and left behind a boundary she would not cross. Then the cowboy returned, not as a rescuer this time, but as a man passing through with dust on his coat and a smile that came easier now. And their reunion held no debt, only recognition, the quiet relief of seeing someone who knew the old version of you and respected the new one. And over supper they spoke of miles and weather, and the way choices stack up into a life. And when he asked if she was happy, she didn't answer right away, because happiness, she'd learned, isn't a thing you hold but a direction you keep choosing. and she told him instead that she was building something solid, that her hands were steady and her sleep was deep, and that felt close enough to joy to honor. Trouble tried once more because trouble always does, in the form of a man who believed old bargains never expire, and when he came calling with threats dressed as rights, she stood tall and named her boundary, and the town stood with her, and the law did its quiet work. And afterward she realized that the night she'd been bought had not defined her, the morning she'd been saved had not completed her, but the days she stood for herself. That was where the story truly turned. When the cowboy left again, it was with a promise that didn't bind, just a hope spoken aloud. And as she watched him ride out, she felt no ache, only gratitude. Because some people change your road and then trust you to walk it. Years later, when she told the story, herself not as a wound, but as a lesson, she always paused, at the part where a man paid double and asked nothing back. And she'd say that kindness, when it's real, doesn't end the story, it hands you the pen time. Did what time always does, it layered meaning onto moments that once felt sharp, and the town by the river grew familiar enough that she could walk its streets without looking. Over her shoulder, could hear laughter spill from the cafe and know it didn't belong to her past. Could watch storms roll in and trust the roof to hold. And yet growth has a way of inviting tests disguised as opportunities. The ranch owner fell ill that winter, not gravely at first, just enough that ledgers piled up and decisions waited, and it was to her that the keys were handed, not ceremoniously, but with the simple assumption that she would know what to do. And she surprised herself by steadying the crew, stretching supplies, bargaining fair, and discovering that leadership isn't loud, it's consistent, and when spring came early and hard, bringing floodwater that threatened the low fields, she rode out in the rain and made calls that saved more than crops, saved trust, saved the future of a place that had taken her in without asking for her story. Word spread beyond the cottonwoods, and with it came offers, some clean, some sharp-edged, and she learned to tell the difference, learned that saying no is a skill as valuable as saying yes, learned that power doesn't have to bruise to be real. Then the cowboy returned again, this time with a purpose that showed in the way he dismounted and waited for her to finish what she was doing before speaking. And when they walked the fence line together, he told her about land up north, rough but promising, about a chance to build something from the ground up, and he didn't ask her to come, not once, only laid the truth of it on the table like a map and said he trusted her compass. And the choice stirred old fears and new hopes. Because independence doesn't mean never wanting company, it means choosing it freely. That night she weighed her life as it was, earned, rooted, respected, against the pull of another horizon, and she realized the decision wasn't between staying and leaving. It was between fear and faith. And in the morning she chose to stay, not because she couldn't go, but because she didn't need to run anymore. And when she told him, he smiled the kind of smile that knows the win isn't personal. It's shared. They parted with a promise to write, a promise to meet again when roads allowed. And as he rode off, she felt whole. Not divided, because love, she understood now, doesn't always mean the same destination. Sometimes it means parallel paths that honor each other's direction. Years folded on themselves. The ranch thrived, the town steadied, and one evening she stood on the porch, watching the river catch the last light, and thought of the night that had almost ended everything. Thought of the price once put on her life and the value she had since proven with her own hands, and she smiled, because rescue had been the spark, but choice had been the fire. The years that followed did not announce themselves with fireworks, but with the quieter proof of a life well kept. And she learned that legacy is built in mornings, when no one is watching, and evenings, when you choose patience over pride. And the ranch became not just a place of work, but a shelter. Others found their way to runaways, widows, boys with more anger than sense, because safety, once earned, has a way of multiplying when shared. She hired fair, paid on time, listened hard, and set rules that protected dignity first. And in doing so, she finally understood what the cowboy had meant on that first night. That saving a life is not about possession, but about possibility, about clearing space for someone to choose who they will become. Word came one autumn that the saloon behind the old corral had burned down, taking with it the ghosts of bad bargains and worse nights, and she felt no satisfaction in the news, only a gentle closing of a door she had already walked past, because forgiveness, she'd learned, is not forgetting, it's refusing to let yesterday steer tomorrow. The cowboy returned one last time under a sky scrubbed clean by rain, older now. Lines deepened by miles and weather, and they sat on the porch without hurry, speaking of roads traveled and roads declined. And when he asked if she ever regretted that night, she shook her head, because regret had no purchase where gratitude stood guard, and she thanked him not for buying her freedom, but for believing she deserved it before she believed it herself. They parted with the easy affection of people who know their stories are braided even if their lives are not bound. And as she watched him disappear into the cottonwoods, she felt the full arc of it settle, how a bottle had once tried to decide her worth, how a handful of coins had interrupted that lie, and how the truest rescue had been the long, stubborn work she did every day after. When she tells this story now, she never centers the cruelty, only the choice, only the moment someone said, "I'd pay double," and meant, "Your life matters." And she looks out over land kept honest and people kept safe, and knows the debt is paid forward, not back. If this final chapter leaves you with the sense that courage can be quiet, that redemption can be practical, and that one brave stand can echo for a lifetime, then don't let the road end here.